Hello, and welcome back to Later Global Cultures. I'm Professor Amy Young, and today we'll do our best to navigate the rapidly changing culture of the modern era. Before we begin, consider this. Can dissonance be helpful? Can you think of a time when your perception, your cognitive understanding, was rocked? How did it make you feel? How did it change you? Studies show that our brains strive to resolve dissonance as quickly as possible. This goes for music, art, philosophy, social ideas, what have you. Dissonance is disruptive, it's uncomfortable, and our brains don't like that at all. So we unconsciously or consciously work to make sense and accept by any means necessary. And there, new understanding and new neural pathways are formed. We recreate our perception so that it's one where the dissonant now makes sense. In the modern era, the culture's understanding of the world and humanity's place in it is shaken, and much of this can be attributed to the anxiety and aftershocks related to World War I. What once was true is now in question, and today we'll see human expression react and try to make sense of what seems to be a senseless world. Today in Later Global Cultures, we'll explore the historical and philosophical context of the modern era. We'll work to understand the sentiments that accompany the modernist temperament, and we'll discuss the expressions of the era as they align with this temperament and modern values. I'll be curious to hear what you make of the shifting expressions in this era. So we'll begin with the tail end of the early modern period when things are starting to get dissonant. It could be that folks are anticipating big changes, or it could be that a trend in experimentation is taking hold. But in case you don't remember, at this time there's a growing frustration and restlessness. Economic disparity in countries and economic competition between nations builds resentment, and some maintain large standing armies. Also, medical advances contribute to overpopulation, food shortages, and housing crises. And then there's that religious insecurity. Morality in general is under scrutiny as folks consider the meanings of good and evil, and they consider a life without God, too. We saw how expressionists were starting to play with emotional outcries and dissonance in visual arts, but this experimentation and angst finds its way into the musical world, too. Arnold Schoenberg broke all restrictions of past music. His work was described by critics as pointless ugliness and perversion, and later, when Nazis heard his work, they declared him a degenerate. But what he gives us is an expression of disharmony in the era via his expressionistic atonal music. With this method, Schoenberg deliberately avoided chords and harmonies, so he avoided those things that made sense and order of music, and he reflected the spirit of his era as he rejected traditional values and expressed a mood of instability. He actually developed a 12-tone technique that became the basis for serialism both in his own era and later periods. With this method, a composer arranges a row or series of tones and uses these tones as the basis for an entire work. No one tone is expressed more often than another, and the music is never exclusively in one key. The tones are arranged into pitch classes, so there is the possibility of harmonic order, but this was not generally Schoenberg's preference. One of his works, Pierrot Lunaire, consists of 21 poems for a woman's voice. The poems describe the actions of an amoral clown who, when he's bored, spends his time getting into trouble and tormenting people. Eventually, the clown is hung, and the work composed by Schoenberg fits this macabre theme. Additionally, the piece is Sprechstimme, which means that the words of the poems are meant to be spoken in a specific pitch. Listen to the composition's opener, Moondrunk, to get an idea. I provided a link for you online, and the harmonic dissonance in this music is not unlike the social dissonance in this era. Another musical expressionist was Igor Stravinsky. He was a Russian composer who also worked in France and the United States, and he famously composed the ballet The Rite of Spring in 1913. When it was first performed, it was called The Destruction of Music as an Art, and it was greeted with hissing, stamping, and a riot that broke out in a newly constructed venue in Paris. Any idea why everyone was so upset? You guessed it, dissonance. The work flouted convention for musical composition, and it wasn't just the music. The costumes, the dance, and the ballet's theme were all outside of the norm. The work tells the story of a springtime ritual, and while it begins unassumingly, the ritual culminates in human sacrifice. The music features changing, complex tones ranging from sweet illusions of springtime to violent rhythms that create a sense of frenzy, and all of this made weightier by the use of a massive orchestra and the turbulent instrumental contrast therein. Additionally, the work repeats some notes obsessively, giving us the sense of ritual, and it violently stresses other notes, giving it an unsettling tone. Check out the link online and see if you find it as jarring as that first audience did. Incidentally, the second performance did not result in a riot. It seems the public had resolved their dissonance and knew what to expect that time around. But the premiere of Stravinsky's groundbreaking work and the ensuing riot took place just 2.5 months before the outbreak of World War I, just 2.5 months before the cultural cauldron finally boiled over. Here's a look at the costumes used in the ballet. You can see similar fashions in the video online, and you should take note of the choreography in that clip too. One other phenomenon who bridges the early modern and modern eras is Pablo Picasso. We've seen some major changes happening in art, and Pablo Picasso is a revolutionary figure who took part and continued much of this change. Just to give you an idea of what sort of person he was, when Picasso was once recalling his own childhood, he stated, "When I was a child, my mother said to me, 'If you become a soldier, you'll be a general. If you become a monk, you'll end up as the Pope.' Instead, I became a painter and wound up as Picasso." Now, I'm sure you're familiar with some of his work, but Picasso did have a period of somewhat realistic painting in his blue period. For these years, he was depressed over the death of a close friend, and the color blue dominated his paintings. That being said, he was more often attracted to the non-traditional, and he was constantly shifting and innovating his style. Plus, he lived to the ripe old age of 91, so he had lots of time to explore new techniques and expressions. One of his most monumental works is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Some claim that it is the most influential painting of the 20th century. In this painting, Picasso is moving closer to abstraction, as representation is dramatically simplified to intensify the expression. And there are non-Western influences on his work too. For one, his work reflects the influence of primitivism, especially with the use of African masks. Later, Picasso collected African masks, and he was haunted by them. He realized they were magical things, mediators to the spirit world, the unknown, and he called the paintings in which he incorporated them his exorcism paintings. La Demoiselle d'Avignon, like other early modern work, is breaking with tradition and charting a new path. In fact, the work is considered the precursor and inspiration of Cubism, and Pablo Picasso was not afraid to charge off in these new directions either, revealing new ways of seeing and unveiling the hidden mores of culture for all the world to see. Now, Cubism actually has a few iterations, but the first to challenge representational reality was analytical Cubism. With analytical cubism, fragments of a three-dimensional object are reassembled in a pattern that stresses geometric structure and the relationships of basic geometric forms. In these works, form, not color, is the focus, and forms are reduced to flat planes with two-dimensional linearity. There is absolutely no lying about the picture plane here. It's certainly a two-dimensional space, and it's not pretending any sort of perspective or realistic depths. Objects here become ciphers, and the viewer must reconstruct the image, so art is not imitating. Instead, we move around the object like the eye and mind move, and only our knowledge of how something is meant to look can determine our perspective. It's only when you've shattered an object into pieces that you can really get close to it, and here they've done that. They're showing that an object from all angles at once, and Picasso championed this movement along with painter George Braque. Incidentally, ideas like these are slow to make their way to America, but Cubism, along with those other movements we've discussed, are introduced to the States at the Armory Show in New York in 1913. So really, it hardly has a chance to take hold before World War I steals all of the headlines. And here's that seminal work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. In the work, we can see that Picasso is familiar with the traditional artistic layout with 5 posed figures and a still life in the foreground. But these figures are anything but classical. The figures are prostitutes. Their poses are somewhat grotesque, and their representation is unconventional, to say the least. In this work, Picasso moved painting closer to abstraction. He came closer to realizing Cézanne's goal of adding weight to impressions and geometrically ordering the representation. We can also see the influence of those African masks. See, at first, these women had normal faces, and Picasso repainted their faces after having seen African masks, perhaps providing us a glimpse of their true spiritual or primitive nature, or asking us to consider our own. Upon viewing the work, George Braque said, "It made me feel as if someone was drinking gasoline and spitting fire." Indeed, Picasso was completely overturning the tradition of realistic representation and perspective, and his was called the greatest challenge to traditional classical ideals since the Middle Ages. And since he painted for decades after this painting made a splash, we'll see more of him later. So, you see, even with World War I looming but yet to begin, creators were laying the foundation of the modern era. I've mentioned it before, but you should remember that modernism in the humanities is the period wherein old ideas are challenged and overturned, and specifically, it's an era that hinges on the events and effects of World War I. Now, some see World War I and World War II as basically the same war with a 20-year peace in the middle, and it does seem like it's a long time that civility went by the wayside and war became a way of life. Nonetheless, in this era, traditions failed and optimism went out the window. The period in which wars were seen as heroic was over. Now there was only the uncertainty that a world at war left in its wake. Once again, I'll recap a little of the war, but I'm assuming you're somewhat familiar with these events already. For our purposes, they set a stage for human expression, and the stage for World War I is set in Austria Hungary. Basically, Austria Hungary wanted to compete with Russia, so they set up shop in Serbia. As you can imagine, the Serbs weren't thrilled with this, and the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated by Serbians while touring military maneuvers in Bosnia. This is what started World War I, and the two sides at war were protecting political interests more than they were defending the rights of Serbs or Austrians. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, and they all wanted to assert their power over other nations who'd monopolized said power for 200 or so years. On the other side were the Allied powers, and they were France, Russia, Italy, and Great Britain. They're mostly defending alliances, but they're also worried about Germany. You see, Germany is a huge industrial force, and they're starting to scare their neighbors. At first, the Allies are mostly concerned with stopping the German acquisition of new land. They get off to a strong start, but eventually they come to a stalemate. Both sides employed trench warfare, meaning they dug trenches in which soldiers hunkered down, popping their heads up every now and again to strike out an offensive. This was slow going, and no one side really made significant gains for 2 years. In fact, it quickly became a war of attrition. Both sides took heavy losses, and many died trying to cross the no man's land between the opposing trenches. For a while, it looked like it might be the last man standing, but two big events changed the pace of the war. One, Russia had to deal with a revolution at home, so they signed a treaty with Germany and got out of the war. And two, a German U boat sank the American ship the Lusitania, a civilian liner that was transporting, among other things, a number of U.S. passengers. This led the U.S. to declare war on Germany, and the fresh troops made a big difference. The Allies took the lead and eventually took the war, but the terms of peace would spell trouble down the line. An armistice was signed on 11/11/1918, and the Versailles Treaty was signed a few months later. In the treaty, the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson urges the creation of democratic governments and an international agency to keep the peace. This was known as the League of Nations. And please pay attention to the fact that I said democratic nations, because this will become significant later. And then there were the terms with Germany. First of all, the treaty with Germany was signed by a shoddy, unstable, new democratic government, and there were many provisions that were meant to keep Germany industrially weak and in check. They weren't able to bounce back until the mid 1920s when those who had suffered defeat rallied nationalist sentiment and denounced the treaty as humiliating for Germany. Austria Hungary did not fare so well. The monarchy ended and they never recovered economically. Finally, there was, of course, the drastic loss of life. 10 million people died in just 4 years, and more often than not, they died in hand to hand or face to face combat. You have to figure that amounted to 6,500 deaths a day, making World War I one of the bloodiest wars in history. Here's the post World War I map, and you can see how each of the powers fared after those treaties. Both sides took some losses, but Austria Hungary was the hardest hit. As you can imagine, global destruction and years of combat make for some strong reactions, even for the winners. And the result here is the lost generation. The lost generation is a term that sometimes refers to the men lost in World War I, but it also refers to the artists, writers, and musicians that stood apart from mass culture. You see, war had made a mockery of what they once saw as their cultural identity, and these artists mourned the loss of cultural certainty. Many became committed to ideas of newness, experimentation, and redefining spiritual meaning. They wanted to find some truth in a seemingly random existence. And theirs is what is called the modernist temper, or the attitude that in this era of progress, folks have the potential to have it all, but in the face of inevitable destruction, it means nothing. Dada is a great example of this. As an art movement, Dada is a sort of anti art protest. Some claim that it got its name when the founders opened the French German dictionary to a word, and there it was. Others say it refers to the name for a hobby horse or the babbled first words of babies, but no matter where it got its moniker, it's a movement that wants to recreate reality. And it incorporated nonsense language, dissonant music, anarchic irreverence to show its disdain for social norms and cultural traditions that failed to prevent mass destruction. The Dada activists staged exhibits in public bathrooms. They planned meetings in cemeteries. They called for the destruction of good manners, and they elevated the spontaneous to a virtue. They wanted to destroy the past so that they could recreate the future. Because of this, the works of Dada artists are iconoclastic, as they're destroying the image of what is revered. And they also incorporate ready-mades or prefabricated items as art. That way, they could redefine what should be revered. Marcel Duchamp was an artist who believed that art was not only meant to delight the eye, but it also must inspire the mind. He played with post-impressionism and cubism, but he really made his mark with Dada. His fountain became an icon for the movement, and it was rejected by the Society of Independent Artists, the exhibit for which he prepared it. What are your first impressions of this work? Does it feel like art to you? With this one, Duchamp points to the classic fountain icons, and then he makes a mockery of them in the way that society puts them on a pedestal by putting a urinal in their place. This piece is a ready-made, and it's perhaps just as shocking now as it was then. So what do you think? Is this dissonance helpful? Is he asking us to appreciate things in a new way? Is he making fun of us? Or is he trying to shift our perceptions? And then his work, LHOOQ, takes on the Mona Lisa, perhaps the most famous artwork of all time. Again, this work is a ready-made, with Duchamp altering a poster of Da Vinci's classic. What do you think of this one? Is there a cultural message here? And take another glance at the title of the work. It's really kind of phonetically interesting. When we pronounce the letters in English, it's almost like he's asking us to look. And when they're pronounced in French, they sound like a phrase. She has a hot ass. So again, maybe he's making fun of what has traditionally been seen as great art and asking us to consider new definitions. Modern authors are also questioning values. When they look back to the past, they find nothing to hold on to anymore, and their works also mourn the loss of certainty and try to recreate culture. William Butler Yeats was an Irish Romantic poet, but his later work is stripped of romantic illusions. His modernist temper is illustrated in works like The Second Coming and An Irish Airman Foresees His Death, where images and sentiment highlight loss and spiritual restlessness. T.S. Eliot is another modernist poet. He's an American expatriate who lived in England, and his work expresses the necessity of cultural continuity in a fragmented and chaotic modern time. The way he describes it, if one is to survive, they need to recover a link to artistic tradition of the past. And this idea is expressed via allusions to religious and artistic histories in his work, especially The Wasteland. One of the lines in this poem reads, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." Let's take a look at some of these guys' work and see if you can catch a whiff of the modernist temper in them. This is Yeats's Irish Airman Foresees His Death. It reads, "I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere amongst the clouds above. Those I fight I do not hate, those I guard I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. No law nor duty bade me fight, nor public man nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seem waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death." Clearly, he's telling the tale of one fighter from World War I, but how does that fighter feel about the war? about his own life, about his purpose in a dissonant time. And here's an excerpt from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men. It reads, "We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. For thine is, life is. For thine is the, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." What do you make of the biblical references in this one? And what about the broken lines and unfinished thoughts? What might all of this be saying about Eliot's time and his cultural sentiment? And fiction also tries its hand at dissonance and revised understanding. James Joyce, an Irish author, sought cultural stability through art. He thought that only art would give people a new worldview and provide meaning. He was constantly searching for a reconnection, and he tries to rebuild the world through literature that rewrites traditions or invents new expressions altogether. One novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, is a thinly veiled autobiography, but it also has allusions to tradition. For instance, the main character, Stephen Daedalus, is named after the Greek mythical builder of wax wings and father of Icarus. In another novel, Ulysses, Joyce writes the Odyssey, the Greek epic about a warrior's suffering as he tries to return home, and he renders the thoughts and actions of the novel's main character, both trivial and significant, in a scattered and fragmented form, similar to the way thoughts, perceptions, and memories actually appear in our minds. But it's also a representation of the era, a representation that is far cry from the ancient, assured, and heroic work of Homer. And in yet another novel, Finnegan's Wake, Joyce even makes up his own language, recreating not just the narrative, but the means by which it is conveyed. Last but not least, Franz Kafka is a German-speaking Jew from the Czech Republic and modernist author. He published almost nothing while alive, and he asked that all of his works be destroyed after his death. But fortunately for us, that did not happen. And what was revealed in these publications is a profound sense of guilt, loss, oppression, muted violence, and nonsensical reality. And the characters in the works try to handle all of these difficulties using the sensible and commonplace means with which they're familiar, and which are completely unsuited for these extreme circumstances. His short story, Metamorphosis, is just such a tale. In it, Gregor, a normal man who's been earning a living to support his family, wakes up one morning to find he's been transformed into a bug. As you can imagine, he's uncomfortable. He's afraid. He has no idea how to operate in this new world, and nothing he might have done in the past is appropriate. His family freaks out. They don't recognize him, and for a long time, they try to ignore the fact that Gregor has changed. His sister tries to take care of him, but eventually his father is forced to return to work, and his family loses interest in him, and they move on. The whole story is told from Gregor's point of view, so we're immersed in his confusion and appalled state, a state that's not unlike the world adrift after the war. Now the term Kafkaesque is used to describe a circumstance wherein one feels trapped by forces that are both ridiculous and threatening. And this story and his others show us the ridiculousness of modern life, the pain of transformation, and the uncomfortability of change whilst holding on to past ideals. The story is not very long and there are audio versions available, so I highly encourage you to read it or listen to it whenever you get an hour to spare. So we've explored some of the sense of loss and uncertainty that plagued culture after the war, but there are other sides to the post-World War I world. For one, with many of the Allied powers, there was a return to business as usual as Britain and France rebuilt physically and economically after the war. And in America, where they didn't need to do as much physical rebuilding, free enterprise creates unprecedented prosperity in the country. This is the era of Henry Ford and Walt Disney. People are connected like never before, and in many places, excess and art are the order of the day. This is the Roaring Twenties, and the Roaring Twenties are a bit like the USA's Rococo era. They have it all, but it doesn't always have substance. Oh, and along with all of that prosperity, mass culture, and optimism, there came a decade of unprecedented greed. People were buying on margin or buying stocks with money they didn't have, and all of this trading in fake profits came to an end on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. On this day, the stock market crashed, marking the official beginning of the Great Depression. But wait, it gets worse. In the 1920s, the Great Plains, America's farming territories, were hard hit with both drought and horrendous dust storms, leaving farmers without crops and without any other means of income. And then totalitarianism was especially prevalent in those nations left out or shunned by the Versailles Treaty, and as well for those who suffered the greatest effects of the Depression. Those weaker democratic governments quickly changed from democracies to totalitarian regimes, and those totalitarian regimes exercised tight control over citizens' lives. In the worst of them, there was no art, no literature, no music, no expression that wasn't sanctioned by or in service of the state. One of the places that went this way was Russia, but there's a little bit of a backstory we should cover first. Remember how Russia left World War I to take care of trouble back home? Well, that trouble was the Russian Revolution. See, the Russian people, upset by heavy losses in the war and food scarcity at home, overthrew the Tsar and ended the royal family's rule. The powers that took over were meant to be balanced, but the provisional government was no match for the delegates from the workers' and soldiers' parties. These parties eventually brought about a second revolution, and while it started out as a people's movement, the October Revolution eventually led to totalitarianism. See, Vladimir Lenin was a revolutionary, and he also really liked Karl Marx's social philosophies. Lenin liked the idea that economics drove history, and he liked that it would eventually lead to a worker led socialist government. But he didn't really want to wait for the proletariat to revolt naturally. Instead, he thought a few guys needed to take the reins and make it happen. He and the Bolsheviks seized the government and created Soviets, or local councils, to restructure the social order. This results in state controlled production and distribution. The Soviets, made up of workers and soldiers, direct production, and Russia becomes a union of these councils, or the United Soviet Socialist Republic. After Lenin dies, Joseph Stalin takes control of the Soviet Union, but imposes his will on the state and exerts power over the council leaders. And here's where that totalitarianism slash fascism kicks in. Stalin is especially dirty. He creates a constitution to secure voting rights for everyone, but it's a sham. Instead, anyone who opposes him is murdered, forced into labor camps, or imprisoned. This goes for politicians, citizens, foreign enemies, what have you. Millions died. I'm not sure Marx or Lenin saw that coming. And Stalin and other fascists were an ugly political reality in the modern era. Fascists believed that the masses should participate directly in the state, but they saw parliaments as outmoded. Instead, they attempted to bring people together under a common sentiment. Sometimes this came by way of nationalistic identity, a reinforcement of the spirit of the people. And while this sounds pretty positive, you have to consider that in this setup, the individual is insignificant and the state is supreme. And that's where your totalitarian control comes in. Fascists enforced dictatorial control over the press and education, and they kept a tight rein on the police force and judicial systems, too. Everyone needed to be educated in the ways of the state, and everyone needed to be kept in check. So, how were these guys able to do all of this? I mean, didn't we just have a ton of revolutions to prevent just this sort of thing? The truth is, citizens thought that their countries needed order, and many of them liked what the fascists were promising. For instance, fascists in Italy wanted to restore the nation to its former glory. They had ideas about how to make it prosperous again, and when they marched into Rome and took the capital, they had admirers. Add to that, they had some successful programs. So, what's a little totalitarian rule when you're trying to put the world back together? Another totalitarian regime popped up in Spain. Francisco Franco was a Spanish general, and he led conservative forces to victory in a Spanish civil war between secular Republicans who wanted to get rid of the monarchy and conservatives who were looking for balance. For his efforts, Franco was supplied with troops and equipment by Germany and Italy, a couple of other fascist states. And last but not least, fascism was perhaps made the most famous by Adolf Hitler in Germany. After World War I, Germany was racked by unemployment and political extremism, and German citizens elected the National Socialist Party to restore order, to restore productivity, and to lower unemployment. Hitler was a part of this movement. He was also a great orator, and with his rousing speeches, he helped create a new national identity for Germany. He assured the Germans of their own superiority, and even as he was raising Germans up, he was blaming the Allied powers, the communists, and the Jews for Germany's destitute state. And mostly, Hitler was well liked. His ruthless treatment of political enemies made the people a little jumpy, but this is ignored as long as he's successful, and many Germans were eager to feel strong and useful again. And just like the modernist temper, all of these political, economic, and social conditions find their expression in the arts. One place where the Roaring Twenties found substance was in the Harlem Renaissance. In the 20s, there was a craze for black culture, and it was fueled by the popularity of jazz. In the Harlem Renaissance, African American writers, artists, intellectuals, and musicians, mainly in Harlem, New York, shared themes of African American experience. Their voices were reborn, and they told us of the lives of Black folks in a white world. Remember, there were amendments that made Blacks free, and then there were social norms that kept them separate. So, this artistic movement shares something of the African American quest for dignity and unified culture amid American racism. This quest was a struggle, and it required them to be nimble and creative. Black artists, musicians, and authors addressed African American self identity, cultural identity, and racial identity in their works. And it's from them that we get some of the very best American poetry, art, and music. Langston Hughes is one of these lasting influences. He was a poet, a novelist, and a playwright, and using his cultural voice, he echoed pioneering American authors as he wrote of the Black experience in America. His work shares Black culture, language, laughter, and music as he attempts to reflect Black life. He didn't want to dress it up or over personalize it, but he did want to dignify it. Here's his poem, I Too Sing America. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Notice that the speaker here is not speaking, not complaining, not chanting, but he's singing. There is joy here. There is mediocrity here. There is humanity here, and there is beauty here. Incidentally, Walt Whitman wrote a poem called I Hear America Singing, and just like Whitman was big on listing all aspects of American life, Hughes is reminding us that he is part of American life too. In the art of the Harlem Renaissance, there is also a search for dignity, and Aaron Douglas is considered the father of Black American art. He was immersed in Harlem culture, and his work combines modernism and African art as it simplifies forms, heralds the Black spirit, and marks the place of African Americans in U.S. culture. He created a series of paintings called Aspects of Negro Life, and the work From Slavery Through Reconstruction is part of this series. In this piece, we can see aspects of synthetic cubism, or art where shapes and color create form. See if you can tell which historical events are being depicted here. What aspects of Black culture is Douglas illuminating? And how does this simplified form help him convey his message? The painting depicts 3 events following the Civil War. You can see evidence of the Emancipation Proclamation at the right, and on the left, you can see the KKK looming over those who still struggle to work in America. Then, in the center, you can see traces of the success of Blacks with the army retreating and voices being heard. Plus, included in this, there is some of the exuberance of jazz represented. There's a trumpet and drums, and some of the figures and radiating colors even look like music on canvas. And that brings us to perhaps the most influential art of the Harlem Renaissance, jazz. Some argue that jazz is the first wholly American form of music, but without a doubt, jazz shares something of the African American heritage and experience. The word jazz was originally slang for doing the nasty, and the term has origins in New Orleans' seedy underbelly, but the music itself has a diverse background. First, there were the blues. These are named for the blue note, or the blending of a melody's note a half step down. The themes of the blues, though, have their roots in Black spirituals and folk songs, and often blues songs tell us about hard lives and hard loves. Their compositions incorporate call and response as listeners and accompanying musicians join in the mourning. Bessie Smith was known as the Queen of the Blues. Listen to her song to get a sense of blues's themes and melody. Later, when blues is combined with West African and Caribbean rhythms and Western harmony, we get something that has greater diversity, a faster tempo, and in this era has greater appeal. And that's jazz. Jazz is sometimes catchy and upbeat, and sometimes it's wholly improvisational, but no matter its form, it still shares something of the African American experience. Often, jazz will incorporate call and response, and it might also include scatting or improvising and using one's voice to utter nonsense syllables in a musical way, kind of making the voice an instrument. Whether it's incorporating Black musical history, celebrating the burgeoning Black identity, or improvising as Black culture tries to find its path in America, jazz is American music. And after World War I, America was hooked on jazz. One derivation of jazz that made it mainstream was ragtime. It gets its name from its ragged musical timing, and this sort of syncopated music was perfected by pianist Scott Joplin. Check out the link online to hear Joplin's jaunting, forward driving rhythms and the playful contrast between high and low registers. As I mentioned, this sort of music became mainstream, and many of Joplin's tunes were recorded for player pianos, so we can still hear them as Joplin would have played them in the 1920s. But it wasn't just the style that made this music a hit for mainstream. Jazz reached larger audiences because of radio and the phonograph. It became the standard of modern orchestras and ensembles, and it was even incorporated into symphonies and operas as it was adopted into white culture. The big band sound is another interpretation of jazz. A big band usually has 12 to 25 instruments, and it was a go to form of entertainment in the era. Duke Ellington, or Edward Kennedy Ellington, helped put the big band on the main stage as he shared jazz with the larger American culture. Ellington was an orchestral virtuoso and a prolific composer. We can hear something of his style in one of his more popular works, Take the A Train. Again, there's a link to this tune online. Take the A Train was written by someone else, but it still features Ellington's orchestral style, and it's works like these that help promote jazz as Ellington and his orchestra perform with some of the most popular musicians of the day. And George Gershwin, a well known composer and pianist, even incorporated jazz in his symphonic and operatic works. He wrote Porgy and Bess in 1935. The opera is set in the 1920s, and it takes place in a poor southern town called Catfish Row. It incorporated all of the 1920s optimism and anxiety as it features love and the African American search for dignity, but it also features addiction, betrayal, and murder. The work was not an immediate success, but it was later made famous by the Houston Grand Opera when it was staged in 1976. Now it's considered a classic, and its opening tune, Summertime, has been covered by thousands of other artists. There's a link available online for this one, too. And while Harlem thrived, other events deflated the 1920s atmosphere of frivolity and prosperity. And they didn't just impact America, they brought down the European economy too. As things fell apart, democratic countries moved toward greater government control. And where democracies failed, totalitarian regimes rose up to fill the gap and put things in order. Pablo Picasso renders an artistic response to Franco's totalitarian regime in Spain in his monumental work Guernica. This was painted as a reaction to the Nazi bombing of a civilian town, a bombing Franco gave Nazis permission to conduct in exchange for their support for his revolutionary efforts. In Guernica, Picasso combines analytical and synthetic cubism in his emotional reaction to the physical destruction of war. The work conveys horror and pain as it presents the terrors of war and tyranny. Why do you think Picasso chose these colors for this work? How does he depict destruction and awareness here? Do you see the figures with tongues like daggers, the dying horse, the severed head, the severed arm? The broken sword, or the reference to Michelangelo's Pietà. What do you think the eye-shaped light overhead is trying to convey? This painting was completed in 2 months and exhibited at the Paris World's Fair in 1937. It traveled the world, bringing attention to the Spanish Civil War, and eventually ended up at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Picasso refused to let it return to Spain until the Franco regime had been removed from power and the people had their lives and prosperity restored. It didn't go back to Spain until 1981. Film, like other mediums, also becomes a tool not just for artistry and entertainment, but for social commentary too. And now they've got sound. See, silent films were made before World War I, but sound was added to film in 1927, and these later, longer, and more complex films are made for a purpose. Still, just because they were propagandistic doesn't mean that they weren't artistic. Films were made to present a point of view with the intent of convincing or educating their audience, and they did this by combining traditional literary, artistic, and musical forms into one artistic masterwork. Sergei Eisenstein gives us an example of just this sort of film in his work, Battleship Potemkin. Eisenstein was a supporter of the Soviet overthrow of the Russian Tsarist regime, and his films highlight the inevitable rise of socialism. Battleship Potemkin is meticulously well thought out as Eisenstein desired the greatest artistic impact, and in the film, he depicts the despicable treatment of the people by the Tsarist military. The story is torn from Russian headlines, as in 1925 there was a mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, and the people supported the mutineers. Eisenstein depicts the crowds cheering the mutineers, and he also depicts the rioters being crushed by the Tsarist police. This event is actually thought to have been a major catalyst of the Russian overthrow of the Tsar, and you can watch Eisenstein's work online to see his use of music, montage, close up, and shadow to make the film even more persuasive. So, as you've seen, there are a number of changes in the world and a number of emotional reactions after World War I. And with this in mind, perhaps it's not surprising that psychology became a prominent scientific field in this environment. The psychologist Sigmund Freud also came to prominence at this time. Freud began his career as a Viennese neurologist, and his forays into psychology attempt to turn the modern mind inward to seek truth of identity. In the end, Freudian psychoanalysis ended up looking a lot like philosophy, as it looks inward and tries to account for human and cultural behaviors. Early on, Freud noticed that dreams played an important role in his analysis of neurotic and hysterical patients. When he looked closely at his patients' descriptions of their dreams, he saw how they illuminated other important connections to their past experience. Eventually, Freud began to believe that sleeping dreams were a sort of wish fulfillment for the subconscious mind, like daydreams are for the conscious mind. As a result, he encouraged free association as a way to connect with the unconscious. Free association is the articulation of one's immediate associations with the waking world, no matter how unreal they seemed, to better understand subconscious desires. In the arts, this exploration of the subconscious to better understand reality is called surrealism. And the surrealist movement borrowed from Freud as it advocated for art and literature based on free association. The aim of the surrealists was to enter the world of dreams and confront myths, fantasies, and fears, and it is conveyed via the pictorial art and literary expression of the subconscious. In these arts, you can tell what the subject is, but often it doesn't quite make sense. And in many ways, imagination is born anew here as it's allowed to be freely expressed without any attempt to control it with reason. And this is the era where life itself is irrational, so surrealism may have helped deal with some of the trauma of war, too. Arguably the most influential surrealist was Salvador Dali. He had an outrageous and odd personality. If you've ever seen him, you know that he usually wore an exaggeratedly long mustache, and he often paired this with a cape and a walking stick. So, yeah, he was just a touch eccentric. Dali lived to the age of 84, and throughout his life, he was influenced by Baroque arts and Dada. Plus, he was a contemporary of Picasso, so Picasso influenced his work too. But he was most influenced by Freud and his ideas of the subconscious, and he attempted to access his subconscious to enhance his own creativity. The rumor is that he would fall asleep with a spoon in his hand. Then, when he was in his deepest sleep, the spoon would fall and he'd wake up to record his dreams. In his paintings, he demonstrates a meticulous classical painting technique, even as he combines somewhat realistic subjects in a strange and hallucinatory way. Here we see his painting, The Persistence of Memory. What do you think? How is his work surreal? How is it addressing a modern preoccupation with death? It's said that the painting conveys surreal ideas within the image, chiefly that time is not rigid and everything is destructible. Notice the melting clocks. Could they point to that modernist loss of certainty? And how does the landscape make you feel? Are you getting a sense of death or isolation? And finally, what's alive in this painting? There's a fly and some ants. What do these insects survive on? And what could this be saying about Dali's world? And with that, I'll leave you to your thoughts on the modern era. In the coming years, dissonance will resolve into skepticism and activism, and we'll see how those come to bear in our next discussion. For now, though, consider what we have in common with the moderns. How have we changed? How do we remain the same? Until next time.